Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to our next edition of Virtual Workshops, the digital privacy series that we've been hosting. We're very excited to take you through our workshop today on location security. And we are going to get through a lot of what that means in a bit, so keep with us. Just to give you an idea of today, we're going to go through an introduction, what location data is and how it's used, the activity, changing your settings online. We'll have a short question answer following a wrap up. But before I do any of that, I do want to introduce myself and my fellow co-hosts. My name is Amir Adala and I work at Consumer Reports, helping with our community engagement, while also focused on digital privacy programming. And I'm very excited to be one of your co-hosts today. And I'm going to pass it over to Kaveh to do an introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaveh Waddell. I am an investigative journalist with the Consumer Reports Digital Lab. I cover technology and society, and I'm interested in power imbalance between big tech companies and consumers like you and me. So digital privacy is a great way to talk about that. Excited to talk to you and answer your questions, and I'll pass it to Kimberly.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Fountain. My title is Mobilization Engagement Manager, and I'll be hanging out in the chat, and feel free to introduce yourself if you haven't already. Thank you.
Hey folks, last CR person on the call with you today. This is Alan Smith, and I'm going to be mostly in the Q&A function, trying to answer as many questions as I can as we go through. And just to answer one question up front, don't worry, we will be sending a recording of this around to everyone after the webinar is completed.
Great, thank you all. As you can see, we have tons of us on the call today to help address any of the concerns you have and be here to answer as much as we can. Before we get started, there are a few things I would love to note. I do want to call out that this is meant to be an overview. We are going to focus as much as we can on location security. While there are so many relevant things and other topics that we could get into, we are just going to focus on the basics and really getting you informed and some actions you can take today in the short time that we have with each other. We also want to call out that we do not want you to stop using online tools. We know that you are using tools and apps and programs, and they are meant for your convenience, and we want you to continue doing that. We just want you to stay safe when you're there and to be able to know what powers that you do have. We also want you to know that we are recording, so at the top of your screen you will see a record button. We are recording so that we can share a video of the workshop with other people who are not able to attend today. And so if you have private information or secure information, please do not share it in the chat. The chat will go along with the recording at the end of this call. Also, there are many ways for you to engage with us. We will be having polls come up through the call, and I'll talk you through a little bit more of that when we get there. We also have this great chat on the side that many of you are already using, so feel free to keep chatting in there. A little bit of a pro tip though, make sure you are selecting all panelists and attendees. As you can imagine, things are going by pretty quick for us over here, and we're not able to answer or see everything as quickly as we would like. So if you make sure you're messaging all panelists and attendees, then other people can support and help you along the way as well. Also, we will be engaging in the Q&A function. So we have Alan, who's paying a great amount of attention to help answer your questions. Please be sure to put them there. We do have a designated Q&A time, as I mentioned earlier. So if we are not able to answer all of them in the Q&A function, we will try to answer as many as we can in this time as well. And we're going to focus on answering as many as we can specific to the location security topic that we are discussing today. And the last part is just to be respectful. We know that we are using Zoom, which has been heightened in terms of its security concerns for users and participants and individuals. Any inappropriate behavior will not only be flagged and reported, but you will be removed from the group. So please be kind and courteous to each other and to your hosts today. Okay, thank you for getting through all of that for me. I want to pass it to Kaveh, who's going to talk about digital privacy.
All right. So digital privacy is always worth talking about, and always worth reminding ourselves how we can sort of take control of our own digital data that we produce. But it's sort of especially interesting during the pandemic, and that's because we're probably spending more time online, connecting with friends and family for school or for work than we were before, and also because we might be doing that on new and different platforms. Think of how much more some of you are using Zoom, now than you were maybe just a few months ago. That means there's a whole host of new companies that might have access to our data, and it's a good time to remind ourselves of how we can take control of that, what tools we have to limit our own sharing, and how we might make decisions about how to do that. So we'll be talking about that today, but at the same time, Consumer Reports has your back in other ways. Journalists like me are working to keep big companies accountable, make sure that they do what they say they do and don't do what they say they won't do with your personal sensitive data. And then our advocates are working to make sure that they come up with new and better policies to protect you when you're online. So I'll pass it back to Amira to talk about our specific topic for the day.
Thank you. So thinking about our topic today on location security, everywhere we go, we are often going with different devices that are able to track and obtain the data in the locations we are. I don't know about you, but I walk around with this quite often. And while not everyone will walk around with their phone everywhere or have their apps going, it's important to understand how the tools that we use are capturing our location data and are sharing our location data. And I really want to highlight that this information, while it might seem small, it might seem useless at times, it is actually very valuable. And there's a lot of information about yourself, about others, about places that people can gather from that data. And so we are really wanting to emphasize that it is important, and sharing where you go, whether it's traveling, whether it's on flights, whether it's in your own area. These are all places that are very important to think about when you have your phone on, which apps are tracking it and what they're using, because your phone can also connect to the Wi-Fi ports around them, or your device's information, and many other places and ways in which your phone captures this. And so when we think about who's using this location data, I just want to highlight some of the places, which is technology companies are capturing this from their apps and programs. We have service providers like Verizon or AT&T. We have third parties who are buying the data. So these are marketers or other companies that find this information very important. And like we're going to talk about in a little bit, we also have the government who is using your data more now than ever for the reasons that Kaveh highlighted. So these are some of the conversations we want to have today, and we want to talk about why is it important to understand about the security of this, and what can we do as individuals to start thinking more progressively, more informatively, and more safely about our location. But before we get into anything more, this is my favorite start of the workshop, which is the icebreaker poll. So very soon you will see a poll jump up on your screen. We only have the polls going for about 30 seconds, so please do answer them as quickly as you can. We realize that the polls don't show up for everyone, so try to take the most informative guess that you can, and I will read out the answers out loud for other individuals to know where people stand and then to know where they stand. So there is no right answer to this. Tell us if you change the app settings on your phone monthly, annually, never, or when it's first downloaded, or other, or not sure at all. All right, the poll has ended. Everyone did great on their first poll, so thank you for participating. So it looks like an overwhelming amount of you, 37% said never, or when it's first downloaded. And so this means when you're downloading it, you're looking at the settings in that moment and then not again. And this can put you in a little bit of danger if there's a lot of settings and apps upgrading that changes your settings. But also 26% of you are doing it monthly, 14% annually, and 24% said other or not sure. And if your answer was other, let us know in the chat, or let others know how often you are upgrading it, because it could be weekly for some of you. It could be more than monthly. I'm not really sure. But it could be tons of times. And I know this takes a lot of time. So for others, they like to space it out. I personally do mine every few months. So I'm in the monthly to annually, maybe probably more monthly category. Kaveh, how often do you do yours?
I'm probably a little closer to annually, maybe like twice a year, but I'm impressed at the large number of people who are looking at this every month. That means got some smart privacy conscious folks with us.
Yeah, although we're seeing the majority in the never or only when they download it. So I'll let you kick us off with telling us more about location data during COVID-19.
Sure. So this is sort of interesting, particularly interesting to think about during the pandemic, because location data has taken on a couple new dimensions. There are a couple ways that public officials and disease experts are using location data to help track the pandemic and contain it. So I'll tell you about two of them in particular. One is to track outbreaks back to where they began. You know, often an outbreak can just sort of happen locally, but sometimes there have been cases where you know, there's been a gathering in one place in the country, say a wedding somewhere, and then people scatter back to their hometowns and take the virus with them. And so by tracking where people came from, officials might be able to sense what the outbreak sort of starting point was and track down some people who might not yet know that they've been exposed. Another interesting way is to monitor stay-at-home orders. So here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live, we've been under one of these stay-at-home orders since mid-March, which feels like a very long time. And pretty soon after it was put into place, officials started to wonder, you know, is it working? Are people listening to us? Are there places where we, you know, might need to change our messaging or, you know, add to our messaging so that people are keeping themselves and others safe? And one of the ways that they can do that is by looking at large aggregated anonymous data sets of people's movements to see, hey, are people moving less this month than they were last month? Are people moving less now than they were this time last year? And they can do that by basically looking at anonymous data sets taken from location data from mostly people's cell phones, smartphones. So those are some of the ways that location data are being used for new purposes in the pandemic. And there are reasons that we should be happy that's the case, and there are some drawbacks that we'll get to in just a moment. But for these projects in particular, there's some guardrails that we want to make sure are in place. We want to make sure there are rules around who can use this data, how they can use it, how long they can use it. So to give you an example, Facebook is one of the companies that allows academic researchers mostly to access this data that they gather. And researchers have to put in a very detailed proposal saying, this is what we want to study, this is how it's in the public interest. Here are the people who will have access to it and for how long. And then if Facebook approves the proposal, that access will be monitored over time to make sure that nobody sort of oversteps the bounds. So we want to make sure that programs like this sort of end when they need to end. Once, you know, we're no longer in crisis mode at some point over the pandemic, you know, we may not want these programs to continue since they are sort of extraordinarily invasive under normal circumstances. We might not be as comfortable with this kind of location tracking. And then it's helpful for us, for consumers like you and me, to understand what's going on so that we can make more informed decisions about what data we share and what we don't share. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about the pluses and minuses, the benefits and the drawbacks of sharing this. So anytime we're talking about digital privacy, it's pretty much a question of benefits and drawbacks. There are certain things that you gain as a consumer from giving up some sensitive data, and then there are things that you lose. So here with location data, there are the health benefits that we just talked about. So these are essentially you're helping keep yourself and others safe by sharing this data. And then there are more sort of run-of-the-mill everyday consumer issues. There are apps and settings and features that just won't really work the way they're supposed to if you don't share this information. So, you know, you imagine you open up Google Maps or Apple Maps or Waze, whatever you use, and you want to navigate somewhere. Well, if it doesn't know where you are, it can't. It's not very useful. If you open up your weather app and you just want to see real quick, is it going to rain today? It needs to know where you are. Otherwise, you have to type in your address every time, and it's not as convenient. So these are sort of matters of convenience and reasons you might want to share your location with certain apps or companies. But there are drawbacks. Amira was talking about some of these before. This is a very, very sensitive part of our lives, where we go, who we go there with, and at what times we go there. It's more than just where you live, where you work. It's, are you dropping folks off at school? Do you go to church? Were you at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting last week? Did you end up at the clinic or the hospital or something? This is very sensitive stuff that you might not want just anyone to have their hands on. There's also a question of who has access to this. So you might think that you're sharing only with a company that you approved to let see your location, only with that mapping app, only with that weather app. But in certain cases, companies turn around and resell or share that data with other companies for marketing. Amira mentioned this. Or in some cases, they might be compelled to turn it over to the government or the police. The police can subpoena companies to force them to turn over data if it's part of an active investigation, a criminal investigation or something like that. So it's not necessarily the end of the road when you shared with a particular company or an app. And so it's useful to remember that, and that data breaches and hacks happen. And sometimes, even a company that had good privacy policies didn't have good security policies, didn't have good cybersecurity, and then, there goes your data out into the world. And so it's important, again, to understand all the different ways that this might be shared, what happens when you share location data, so that you can make better choices about who to share it with and when to limit that sharing. And now we'll give it back to Amira for a quiz.
Yes, so we tested our polling earlier, but I had 3 more poll questions for you all. So I'm going to start nice and easy. We'll start with the first one on how do you prevent location tracking on your mobile device? Do you turn off your phone? Do you, I lost it. Do you turn off your phone? Do you turn on airplane mode? Do you leave your phone at home, or all of the above? It looks like we might have a different question in the poll right now, which I'm just noticing. Yep. Okay, let's go with this question in the poll, and I'll just change our slides really quickly. So true and false, when you opt out of location sharing, there is no way that a company can gather your details. And so there we go. There's the right question. Hopefully you didn't see the answer. We can stop the poll. Looks like a bunch of you are already in it, and we'll discuss this one. All right, so overwhelmingly, 63% of you answered false, which is in fact the right answer. And so we'll talk a little bit about this, but as we've heard and as we've seen a lot in the news and in media, more often than not, there's a lot of companies and organizations that said, we didn't mean to collect this data, or we told you could opt out and then we accidentally collected it. And so there is a large risk as a consumer as to what actually is collected when and how much you can trust the organization. Normally than not, I'd say you can trust a lot of the organizations when they say this, but I do want to highlight that it is a little bit of a risk. And I'll give you a very concrete example. In 2018, Google users learned that the company continued to collect location data regardless of the setting that they have chosen. So even if they chose to opt out. And Associated Press in 2018 also came out with saying that some apps will track you and store timestamped location data from your devices, even without you knowing, or even if you've opted out of more generic data collection. So 63% of you are correct. You've said that this was false. 10% of you said true, and 27% of you said not sure. Okay, so let's get the next poll up and running, and I'm just going to do a quick check on which one it is. So I make sure I go to the right one. Yep, we're gonna go back to the question. So give me 1 second while I just revert back quickly. You'll see this is the question that I originally had, and hopefully you didn't see my response. But if you did, don't worry. I thought this one was a little bit easier, so that's okay if you know this one. So how do you prevent your location from being tracked? Are we gonna turn off our phone? Are we gonna activate airplane mode? Are we not gonna take our phone out? Or all of the above? We'll just give it a couple more seconds and then we'll talk through this answer. Okay, great. So 10% of you said to turn off your phone, 5% of you said to activate airplane mode, and about 15% of you said don't take your phone. But 69% of you said all of the above. And like the slide has said, all of the above is the correct answer. There's many ways that your phone can still transmit signals, whether it is through your service provider or Wi-Fi. So the only secure way to actually block that signal and block the Wi-Fi is by doing any of these 3 steps. And so if you are out in areas where you do not want your location tracked, sometimes we're out in more sensitive areas or doing activities that we just don't want surveilled or tracked or shared in any sort of way. These are often the methods that we tell people to take. Okay, we got one more question. All right, the last one. So Google will delete your location data after 18 months. Is this true? Is it false? Are we not sure? I don't know. I'm gonna tell you and be honest. I think this one's a little tricky. This one's pretty hard, especially on the heels of some of the other questions that we've gotten. Especially since we're thinking about are we sure that organizations like Google are taking care of our ops out? Are we trusting them? Are we taking the risks? What are we doing? Okay, we're gonna share the results right now. So 6% of you said it was true, which in fact is the right answer. So the answer is true and 6% of you got it. 51% of you said false, and 43% of you said, I'm not really sure, which is very fair. Just to give you a little bit of background and why this one is a little bit tricky is recently, actually in 2020, after much backlash over previous years of users demanding more care for their location data, Google did announce that it will automatically start deleting users' location histories and their web activity after 18 months. So previously you had to turn on the setting and Google would store it for an indefinite amount of times, and they would use this location data often in a lot of their tools and resources. And so this move allows Google to still hold on to your information and recommend things that you will like in your browsing history or others, but it won't have years of your private data. Right now it will have at the max 18 months. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit now that you know more about how to take those actions, which are the more tangible stuff that people I know love and enjoy. So I'm gonna pass it to Kaveh, who's gonna talk about our location settings on our devices.
All right, so here's how you can actually find these controls and start making the changes that we've been talking about. So I'm gonna go through how to do this on Android devices first, and then I'll go through iPhones. I might go through these a little bit more quickly than you can follow along with your thumbs at home. But again, this will be recorded and posted so you can slow me down and watch again later if that's helpful. So starting with Android, you'll go to the Settings app. And then from there, you'll go to Google, which is a section in the Settings app. That's because Google basically runs the show on Android phones. They're the ones who make the software. And then from there, you go to Location. There you have the nuclear option. You can turn off location access entirely. That means nothing on your phone, no apps can get that information about where you are. That might be fine if you're really looking to lock yourself down, but it does mean that those examples I gave earlier, like those maps and weather apps, won't be able to tell where you are. If you want to pick and choose, you can choose for each app, does it get location access, does it not? There are those you might not trust, and then there are those you might think, you know what, I don't need this, e-reader app, for example, to know where I am when I'm reading. So you just turn that off, and then it won't have access to that anymore. And then you also can do this for other Google products like Mail or Calendar or whatever it is. Those settings are all in there. Let's go now to the next slide and talk about iPhones. It's not too different. You start again in your settings app. From there, you go to privacy. It's like a purple block with a hand on it, and then to location services. There again, you have the same option, turn it off entirely for everybody, or change them one by one. And there's one extra sort of level of granularity here. You can say always, which is what it sounds like, never, which is also what it sounds like, or only when you're using the app. And I find this useful. I have a lot of apps set to only when I'm using the app. These are things that I feel like I want to be able to use the features that only work if the app knows where I am. But I definitely don't feel like it needs to know where I am when I'm not using the app. So, think about your favorite ride-hail service, for example. You might not have used these recently, but when you do, again, in the future, your Ubers and your Lyfts and whatnot, you might only really need them to know where you are when you're using them, and then you really don't want them to know when you are at other times. This is a good way to make sure that happens. Going now to the next slide, those are sort of the big phone-based settings, but individual apps, especially from social networks that are especially hungry for data about you, will have these settings as well. So you can check Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever you're using, and most of them will have a location setting that you can change, and you can pretty easily find out how to do that if you just Google it, or use another less tracking search engine if you prefer. There are location tracking specific apps on my iPhone. It's called Find My Friends, for example, and these are ones that you use to find out exactly where individuals that you've agreed to share your location with are. I use this with some family members, but you want to go in there and make sure that you haven't accidentally given permission to somebody that you don't really think needs to always know where you are in there. That's just by going into the app and looking at the list of people. And then there's other devices. We're only talking about phones in detail today, but if you have a tablet, if you have a computer, whether it's a laptop or it's a desktop, big guy on your desk, they also have ways of figuring out where you are. They might not use GPS like your phone does, your tablet might, but they can still figure out where you are. So each of those will have their own separate ways to make changes to location data settings, and they vary pretty wildly. So I won't go into it here, but you can find those pretty easily and make those changes as well. Now getting to that question about location history in Google. That was that last question in the quiz here. Here's how to actually delete your location history entirely. This is on a browser now, what I'm talking about. You are on google.com. You can be on any Google site, so gmail.com, Google Maps or whatever. And in the top right, you'll see that little icon, that circle icon. It might have your face in it or your initial. You click on that, and then you click on Manage Your Google Account. This is the master control panel for all things Google and all the things that they collect about you. You go then to Data and Personalization, and a lot of interesting things here that you can scroll through. The one that we're interested in is location history. You click on that, it'll tell you if it's on or off. You hit pause if it's on and you don't want it to be on. Pause makes it sound temporary, but in fact, it's off until you decide to go in and turn it on again. So that will, if you hit pause, from this point forward, Google will no longer keep a history of where you are and plot that on the map and use that for other services like marketing or maps or whatever. So that's how to delete your location history. On the next slide, we'll talk about how to do this automatically. You can choose how long Google is going to hold on to this information. It can hold on to it indefinitely. They would prefer that. You might prefer that if you really like some of the timeline and history features that they have, or use various other features that are enabled by this. But if you don't want Google to know things about you for a very long time, you can limit it to 18 months, which, as Amira said, is the default, or you can make it as short as 3 months. So you still get a little bit of history, but 3 months back, it gets auto-deleted. I want to address also a question that I saw a couple of folks having in the chat, which is, can we trust Google to do this when we ask them to? my sense is yes. If you affirmatively ask Google to delete your data, and then it turns out that they haven't deleted your data and someone finds out, they could get in serious trouble. That's the kind of thing that I would trust Google to do if you ask them to. That doesn't mean they're always completely straightforward, not just Google, it's just about any company, that they're always completely straightforward about how they use your data. All these companies are masters at using slippery language to sort of avoid telling you exactly what's going on. So to take the example that Amira was talking about before, you might turn off one setting, think you're done, but in fact there's other settings that you have to turn off as well. So that's kind of the level of suspicion that you might want to have with these big companies, but generally you might take them at their word for like a very specific setting like this. And then you might also think about different companies in different ways, right? So like a big company like Google, Facebook, Apple that you might distrust for one reason or another, for their track record, for example. But then like a small company that makes an app that you've never heard of, maybe just like a game that someone recommended to you the other day, you might have more reason to distrust what they're going to do because you just don't really know what they're about, who they are, where they are. In some countries there are fewer privacy protections, and so there are other reasons to be distrustful of that. I can also talk about business models of different companies, but we might get to that later. I want to give it back to Amira to wrap things up with some actions.
Thanks, Kaveh. Just to stay on this topic for one more second, I always talk about how I have a conversation with myself for every app that I use, and I have to decide, do I want the location shared on that specific one, how valuable it is for me? And so I don't know, Kaveh, if you do the same, but also, it's not as easy for some people just to turn off all the location data for everything, because if I did that, when I needed maps, I would have to go in and turn it on for everything. So do you have this part too, where you turn on and off for some, or do you just turn them all off? What is your process in it?
Like I said, I use that only when using this app function a lot. I find that pretty useful. Those are the ones that I'm sort of about. I actually don't think I have too many apps that I allow to access my location all the time. Maybe a mapping app. There's a transit app that I like and trust. That back in the day when I got on buses and light rail all the time, it was useful for it to know where I was, so that it could say, you better run, it's coming in 3 minutes. But that list is very small. And most of the others are either on no or only when I'm using this app. And then it's always useful, like you said, to go through, look at them individually. And if one of them makes you, raise an eyebrow, like, why does this app need to know where I am? Just turn it off.
Yeah, I have that conversation quite often where I'm like, is this right? If I turn this off, I'm just going to do it and see, I don't need this for now. I do also want to call out that these settings might look differently on your phones. So often just going into your settings and just poking around and figuring out how to adjust your personal location, because it could be different on browsers or on devices. So do investigate, and if you have trouble, just let us know. We are here to help, but these things do change quite often. So we do want to make sure you are able to see whether you could turn off all the locations or how to do it individually on each app or program that you're using. And with that, I am going to go next to the actions that we have listed. So as an individual, there are many things that you are able to do. And part of what we wanted to do here was just share more information about this topic, but then also how do you take actions and what can you do? So the first one is to update your settings. It looks like a bunch of you are either not doing this or doing this when you first download your phone. I hope that's skewed more towards when you first download your phone as opposed to never doing it. But we do want you to know that your settings are there for you to control. And then a large part of you are doing this more frequently. And that's where we really want to shift behavior. It could be time consuming. You might have to have conversations with yourself or even with others or check online. But you should go through this process fairly regularly because things are updating. and things are changing. And every time I go into my phone to update the settings on my apps, I realize I've downloaded new apps that I hadn't even reviewed yet. So it is important to get this behavior going. A next one is using a VPN. We do have articles from Consumer Reports on how to select VPNs. I know that's a question that comes up quite often for people, but please do use a VPN, which is able to secure the location settings of devices that you are using. If you want more information on this, I do encourage you to search or look at the articles we'll be putting in the chat. But this does ensure that your location is not disclosed to third parties or other sorts of programs on the device or where you're accessing or the sites you're headed to. As well, do opt out when you don't need to share. Even though we've seen these horrific examples of organizations in the past that are still not taking this seriously or have mishaps in this, it is important for you to know that part of your control is to opting out and making sure that we can exercise our rights in this. While someone like me would like an opt-out as a default, there is a lot more work that we have to do as a consumer while we wait for the inevitable, which I'm hoping is the inevitable, that the opt-out is the default in any sort of site or programs that we use. Also, there is a lot more actions we can take when we advocate for federal privacy laws, where we can ask people to take more seriously the demand and the trading and the sharing of our location data, and how we hold organizations and companies accountable to not only keeping this secure when they have it, but also not collecting it or not storing it. And then lastly is demanding the user control. So making sure that as much of the data that is collected is being held with you, so you have control over it, and others are not able to manipulate or do things in the examples that Kaveh gave earlier, like police force or other sorts of examples of people who are using it without any rules at all. So these are the actions we want you to be aware of. These are the actions you can take. Hopefully Consumer Reports can help you through taking some of these actions, whether they're individual or more on the federal privacy laws that we hope to encourage more of across the nation. Okay, so we have gotten through the main portions of our programming, but this is the great time when we get to hear more about the questions you still have. Kaveh, are there any that are apparent to you or pulling out?
Yeah, there are a couple here that I wanted to start off with. Two questions about what happens to your location data in the background. So this goes back to that setting I was talking about that I like on iPhones that lets you decide that you only want an app to be able to see where you are when you're using it, and then it stops when you're not. So one attendee asks, if I choose to allow location only when using an app, does the app track location while in the background? Say I forget to force quit the app. So this is a great question. This is the distinction between, you just, slide out of an app or press the home button and you stop using it versus you quit it manually. If you choose only when using, that means only when it's on your screen. So when you close it, it might keep showing that little icon in the corner that says it's using location data for another couple seconds, but it needs to, and in fact, it's cut off from being able to see your location as soon as you close it. You don't have to force quit it. You don't have to do anything fancy. You just close it. So that's how that one works. Another attendee asks, why would I need to have an app always on if you're not using it? That's a good question. This was the default until fairly recently. I agree. Why would you need this in almost every instance? To go back to the example that I gave about that transit app, mapping apps, generally this can be useful to do with because sometimes you're waiting for your train, you're waiting for your bus, you go out of that app, you close that app, and like I said, if it's background only, then it can no longer see where you are. You send a text, you look at your email, you watch a video, and you want it to still know where you are, especially if you've moved, you're on a bus at that point in time. And so there are some instances where it might make sense to choose that option. I want to also answer a different question that I got. This is about exposure notification apps for COVID-19. So this actually just made the news last night. Virginia put out the very first exposure notification app for detecting exposures to the disease. This uses an Apple-Google technology that the two companies made together, which is pretty rare. And it allows people to basically be able to tell if they came into contact with someone who later tests positive for the coronavirus over the last 2 weeks. And the question asks something really smart. It says, they say it doesn't use location services, but instead it uses low energy Bluetooth signals. It's supposedly anonymous. It doesn't save user data, but I'm skeptical. So this is an important distinction. We've been talking today about location data that's usually taken from GPS or some of the other forms that Amira brought up. This is, for example, Wi-Fi networks that are nearby and whatnot. But this is something that pinpoints you on a map. It allows a company or a service to say, here's where you are and here's where you were, 5 minutes ago or 5 days ago. That's different from what these COVID-19 exposure notification apps are doing. They don't know where you are. You could be on the moon, you can be in the desert, you can be in the middle of New York City. All they know is what other devices are near you. So if you opt into using one of these, and if you're in Virginia, you can now download the app called COVID-Wise, all one word, COVID-Wise. Opt into it with your iPhone or your Android phone. And other people who have done the same will basically log anonymously any encounters that are within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes. Those are the CDC guidelines for what kind of an exposure could potentially be dangerous. Then if one of you reports that you got a positive test for the coronavirus, everyone else that came into close contact with you over the past 2 weeks will be notified without anybody, and by anybody I mean Apple, Google, the public health organization, the government, without anybody actually knowing who was involved in that interaction and where it occurred. So this is, you're right to be skeptical and think twice about it. It is actually a very safe and much more privacy preserving type of tracking than the kind of location tracking that we've been talking about. So I hope that helps. Amira, maybe I'll pass it back to you for a question or two.
Yeah, well, Kaveh, I totally forgot to mention the recent news this week that we've been talking about, which was the announcement from the NSA on location data and how it is a security threat. And so we didn't get to properly talk about this, but I think it is really relevant to us discussing, like, what does it mean when organizations around are actually understanding that our location data is a threat to that existence, especially organizations like the NSA. So I did post that article in the chat if individuals want to check it out. There's a lot of information online. It makes location data very timely right now. And as someone who is well aware of that, it's interesting to see more people grow in that awareness and just understanding, and how more people in positions of power or security are actually learning that we as all individuals need to take better steps in terms of our protection. So that is something that I did want to bring up because I'm seeing some questions that made me think of it, but also, we just hadn't mentioned it yet. I know something that Kaveh and I came across and we're like, wow, this is so relevant to the conversation.
Maybe someone was listening in on our webinar prep. I'm not sure. Maybe that's why they put it out. I did find it really interesting. This line really popped out at me. This is a bulletin from NSA itself. It just says location data can be extremely valuable and must be protected. And it's kind of an acknowledgement that especially when you're doing particularly sensitive activities. But no matter who you are, you're sort of pitted against technology companies and marketing companies that have a vested interest in learning more about you and then making money off of that information. So you get to decide to a large extent how much you want to share that information. And that reminds me to go back to a comment that I made earlier about business models. I think this is an interesting way to think about your relationship with all the companies that you interact with, maybe without even realizing it, just in a day's worth of using your phone, just from all the different apps that are on your phone, and then all the companies that those app makers might be turning around and sharing or selling your data to. There are different ways of making money as an app developer. Some apps make money, most apps make money by doing just that, by selling your data or using it for marketing. That's very lucrative. It's kind of the tacit acknowledgement that you make when you when you start using especially a free app. Imagine you use Facebook, you're not paying for it, somebody's paying for it. The way that Facebook makes money, Google is the same way, is by using information that you share with them voluntarily, or that they might entice you to share, so that you can use their great tools and platforms. They are able to use that for marketing. Some companies don't do that. Some companies make money by charging you a subscription. If you're paying $5 a month, $10 a month for an app, then it might not necessarily, and I say necessarily because it's worth checking, but it's less likely to have to use your data for marketing, and it might be less likely to be sharing that with other people. Then there are companies that make money by selling you stuff, like Apple makes money by selling you a MacBook or an iPhone, and then goading you to buy a new one next year because, oh look, it has another camera. That is their revenue stream, so they don't have to turn around, and they don't sell your data. So I got a question earlier. What are the most private weather and navigation apps on iOS? I'm sure there are several that are good options, but as a general rule, the apps that are built into your iPhone when you get them, Apple Maps, Weather, I think it's just called Weather, they might have usability issues. Apple Maps, especially early, got dinged for this. I use it now because I actually think it's gotten really good. But since they are sort of inside that closed Apple world, that they're not turning around and reselling your data. And so you have a little bit more of a sense of, the roadblock at the end of the road in terms of selling, instead of just not having a sense of what happens to your data. So that can be an interesting way to think about individual apps as you're going through that list and making those decisions: share, don't share, sometimes share, however often you do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I do want to address just one of the questions around emergencies. Kaveh talks a lot about, the good uses of location settings, and definitely some of the concerns. So while we understand that there are emergencies that happen all the time, and there are situations in which you want someone to know your location, this is referenced quite a lot by people in the industry that says if someone's calling for an emergency and to be able to get to them quickly, having their location data on is very helpful. And so that is something we consider and we think about and should be part of the thought process. But I do recommend still taking the same steps that you are doing right now. And if there is a concern for you in terms of health or emergencies, or somewhere that you think there will be an emergency, there are apps and programs that you can use and leverage to let people aware and so of where you are. There are different health emergency apps and others. And so there are devices that you can give specific permission to have your location or have that information in the event of emergencies. And so that is somewhere I would look in if that's a very specific concern. But this is the sort of conversations that we want to be having. These are what I call the ethical conversations of you could be in an emergency, but do you want to be sharing something that impacts you throughout your life? Both are very valuable, both are very important. How do we adjust and accommodate for that in the current setting with current organizations? Or sometimes just simply the questions could be, who is accessing that data? Can people access it after? Is it deleted automatically? These are the other types of questions we can have around these concerns. So I would continue to urge you to think about these sort of things and play them out in your head, have a good idea of what is a situation that is best for you. Okay,
That's great.
questions. Kaveh, let's take a few more.
Sure. This one's a little bit more of a comment, but I found it really interesting, and I just wanted to amplify it for everyone. One viewer says, sometimes I offer Google reviews on places I've been. It seems Google knows a lot about where I visit or dine and automatically sends me opportunities to do the review. I'm thinking I should discontinue this practice and shut down my location info. That's a choice that you can make. I don't think we can prescribe that for you, but what I found interesting about this is sometimes there are these sort of surprising moments where you're like, whoa, how did you know that about me? You know, it pops up and it's like, hey, how did you like going to that neighborhood pizza place last week? And you're like, well, I didn't tell you that I went there, but in fact you did. It's because Google has been keeping track of where you've been. And so hopefully with what we went over today, you can take control of that if you decide that's not something you want to do. But it is useful to sort of be on the lookout for these moments where you know, something happens and you're like, I don't think this company should have this piece of information about me. And then you can start to think and sort of go down the rabbit hole. How did they figure that out? And how do I shut off that valve if I don't want that company to know things like that about me? So I just wanted to share that with everyone, and then go through a couple small, quick questions that might help others. One person asked, could you please say a little bit more about how to find location options in individual apps? So again, for on your iPhone or on your Android, if you go into the location part of your settings, which is usually privacy location settings, that's in your settings app on iPhone, or Google location on most Android phones, you can find a whole list of your apps. On your iPhone also, if you just open your settings app and scroll down to the list of your apps, you'll just see every app that you have installed on your phone in alphabetical order. And if there's one in there that you want to change the settings, you can just go in right there, and all the settings, most privacy settings for that specific app will be there. So you can decide, can it run in the background? Can it access your location? Can it access your camera or microphone? That's a conversation for a whole nother day. But that's a good way to say, you know, say there's one app in particular or one company in particular you're a bit leery of. You can go into that section of the settings and make all the decisions you want right there. So I just wanted to share that. One person asked, can people living outside Virginia use COVID-Wise? That's the exposure notification app. You can, but it's not going to be as useful because only people living in Virginia are able to upload those reports of positive coronavirus tests, which is sort of the key signal that will actually start telling people, hey, this is someone that you know, there was an exposure that may have occurred. So basically, no, you can't use it in any sort of useful way yet. But several states are working on their own apps, and then there's also a push for apps that work across state boundaries. So stay tuned. There probably will be something, potentially will be something where you live in the coming months. One more, if we've still got the time, a quick one is the Google 18-month limit only for google.com or for all web activity. It's kind of in between. It's not just for google.com, the search, but it's also not, unfortunately, for the entirety of your activities on the World Wide Web. It is for the Google empire, which might be larger than you realize, but it's for any Google product, Gmail, Maps, Calendar, I don't know, Google Plus. I don't think that's a thing anymore, but like all the various things that Google owns and that people use regularly. So they're all governed by this control panel that I told you about. I think those were the ones I wanted to go through. Amira, were there any others on your radar?
Yeah, we had a question about Siri, and so I just want to bring it up and talk about other connected services or devices. And I know that Kaveh touched on this earlier, so this is more of a reminder. But you know, these things are also tracking your location. They have the ability to collect that data. And as many of you know, to operate them, you do often have devices connected to them. So more often than not, if I have like an IoT device in my home, my mobile device is connected. And that in itself is able to share the location data through how often I'm there, or what am I doing, or what times in which I'm physically within reach, or how far I might be away. So just to be conscious, while we are very much focusing on mobile devices here and touching a little bit on your browser, it's important to have these location conversations with the other hardware devices that Kaveh had said earlier. And then I do want to also include things like Siri, which are connected in these devices that are also able to pick up on location or others based on what you say, or just based on if it's on and knowing where you are. Sometimes this is convenient. It gives you recommendations on a bunch of stuff, or it's able to find things for you, but do know that that convenience has a little bit of a cost, which is your location data. And now I'm leaving it up to you to decide whether that is worth it or not. Okay, so I am going to quickly go towards the wrap up. Glad we had so much time for questions. I know that there still is more. We're going to quickly try and finish those up before we head out, but we'll just quickly wrap up on the last hour-ish that we've been together. I do want to let you know that we are following up with links and the recording. So you will get many of the article links that we've sent in the chat, or we've talked about. Don't worry if you weren't able to capture them. We understand it goes quickly. We will send that with the recording and the slides so that you are able to follow all the steps, all the conversation, all the things that were asked on your own time, because we know that sometimes this does take time. Also, feel free to suggest topics or areas of interest for you for future workshops. We are also always open to what our community and what the people joining us want to hear. It is crowdsourced more often than you think. And the last thing is, we know that there's been some confusions or questions. If you do have anything else you do want to check with us, please do email community@cr.consumer.org. We are there to continue having these conversations with you and continue looking out for your digital privacy, both in a COVID-19 world, but also in a world where we're trying to put consumer concerns at the priority and foremost of our digital presences. So with that, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming with us for the last hour. It's been a pleasure to have you all, and we can't wait to have you next time. Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.